Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was somewhat surprised that my question to the Prime Minister on December 5th, just before our Christmas break, was viewed by whomever categorizes my late show questions as one relating to natural resources, as I really felt it dealt with First Nations rights and responsibilities of the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs and Northern Development. The reality is, though, Mr. Speaker, that the question I raised deals with a very critical issue in general, and also with a very disturbing issue in the particulars. And it says, Mr. Speaker, on December 5th, I asked the Prime Minister, coincidentally, it was the same day that the Prime Minister's own special task force, he asked Mr. Doug Eyford to prepare a report on forging partnerships, building relationships between First Nations in relation to West Coast energy projects that are being proposed. And that report came out and made it very clear what everybody knows, which the Supreme Court has made abundantly clear, that the federal government, in fact provincial governments, and as well corporations dealing with First Nations rights and territories, have a very strong constitutionally protected requirement to fully consult in a meaningful way with First Nations before participating with resource development on their land. In fact, Mr. Eyford's report urged the Prime Minister to first, he had 4 points, build trust, foster inclusion, advance reconciliation, and then taking action. Well, Mr. Speaker, what I raised with the Prime Minister was the very distressing case of what took place on Elsipogtog First Nation, a Mi'kmaq community near Rexton, New Brunswick, where the First Nations community was dealing with an energy proposal, the non-conventional issue of hydraulic fracking. The community of Elsipogtog was widely supported by people in New Brunswick and the adjacent community who also are very concerned and don't want fracking. They're concerned about their groundwater. And it's clear that the Houston-based company, SWN, that wanted to do this hydraulic fracking, the protests that led to arrests were against the seismic testing to be conducted by this private sector company from Houston, Texas, supported by the New Brunswick Premier, but not by the people of New Brunswick and not by the Mi'kmaq people, was in fact to do exploration without having consulted Elsipogtog, without having consulted the Mi'kmaq First Nation, in contravention of numerous court decisions, most notably, of course, the Marshall decision, which dealt specifically with Mi'kmaq First Nations rights. This is a First Nation that has unceded territory. They have not ceded this territory. No treaty could possibly be produced that would allow what has been going on in New Brunswick with the pressure for hydraulic fracking on First Nations territory. What I asked the Prime Minister was, in the context of these increasing, I'll quote my question, in the context of the increasing tensions in New Brunswick, in the fracking protests there, does the Prime Minister recognize that he is legally bound by our Constitution to ensure that the Mi'kmaq of Elsipogtog are fully consulted in advance of any fracking on their unceded territory? A close quote. The Prime Minister responded by saying he understood his obligations and in fact had just received the reports which I referred moments ago from Mr. Eyford. I remain deeply concerned about this incident. As a representative of British Columbia, a member of Parliament for Saanich Gulf Islands, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety about what could be coming if there should be, God forbid, a pipeline approved over First Nations territories where British Columbians and First Nations don't want it. If the example of what has taken place at Elsipogtog were to be played out in British Columbia, I'm deeply concerned. There was neither consultation, nor was there attempt to build trust, nor good relationships, nor reconciliation, but instead the violent movement of RCMP arrests on what had been, up to that moment, a non-violent protest. And I think we need an explanation.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to let my colleague know that I think she's aware that the fracking issue is mostly under provincial jurisdiction, but I'm happy to say that our government always strives to meet its constitutional obligations. Aboriginal consultations are a key part of our responsible resource development initiatives, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to explain how our government is working to strengthen Aboriginal involvement in Canada's resource sectors. Canada's resource industries already employ some 32,000 Aboriginal people, more than any other sector of our economy. This level of employment will only increase as we see more and more projects come forward. Indeed, over $650 billion worth of projects have been proposed, and the majority of which are near or on Aboriginal lands. these projects can have an enormous positive impact on the prosperity of Aboriginal communities. The member opposite has been clear in our opposition to resource development, and I hope the member opposite will excuse me if we follow a different path. Our government wants to ensure that we develop our resources responsibly to create jobs while ensuring the environment is protected. Our government's plan for responsible resource development is improving Canada's regulatory system by reducing red tape and modernizing processes while strengthening environmental protection and enhancing consultations with Aboriginal peoples. As my colleague mentioned, we're taking action. Douglas Eyford, Canada's Special Federal Representative on West Coast Energy Infrastructure, recently provided the government with recommendations that will support greater Aboriginal participation in resource development. Mr. Speaker, the themes of the Eyford Report, trust, inclusion, and reconciliation, can guide all parties in building further the relationships that will underpin responsible resource development and the participation of Aboriginal peoples. This report from the Special Federal Representative is a solid basis for sustained engagement with West Coast Aboriginal people. It recognizes an opportunity for Aboriginal communities to realize long-term benefits and to be partners in West Coast energy development. Our government has been, currently is, and will continue to engage with Aboriginal communities on concrete ways to move forward on the recommendations in the report. Mr. Speaker, the Eyford Report builds on previous initiatives taken by our government to support Aboriginal participation in the resource sectors. For example, in 2012, the federal budget provided more than $690 million for skills development, education, and infrastructure. In addition, our plan for responsible resource development includes a commitment to ensure that consultations with Aboriginal peoples on a natural resource projects are more consistent, accountable, meaningful, and timely. The plan includes, number one, Mr. Speaker, integrating consultations with Aboriginal peoples into the new environmental assessment and regulatory processes. Two, providing $13.6 million over 2 years to support Aboriginal consultations on projects. Three, designing a lead department or agency as a single Crown consultation coordinator for each major project review. Four, negotiating with provincial and territorial governments to better align government processes and improve the involvement of Aboriginal peoples. And finally, Mr. Speaker, number five, promoting positive and long-term relationships with Aboriginal communities in order to facilitate greater participation of Aboriginal peoples in the direct and indirect benefits of new resource projects. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
The honourable member for Sandwich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his statements. And of course, I did reference Mr. Eyford's report, but it's clear from the events in Elsie Buktuk that certainly comes too late for that relationship. There has been no consultation advance, and while it is true that fracking is a provincial responsibility, the federal Environment Commissioner in the fall 2012 report found that the parts that are federal, such as tracking toxic chemicals that are used in fracking, that Environment Canada did not even have a full list of those chemicals that are used in fracking, and it remains always federal fiduciary responsibility to ensure First Nations rights are not being infringed in resource development. As to the question of going forward in British Columbia and my opposition to resource development, I don't oppose resource development. I oppose the reckless, untrammeled, rapid development of oil sands for the sole purpose of shipping out raw product. If the bitumen were being processed in Alberta, I think our discussions would be very different. But all pipeline proposals are for raw bitumen mixed with a diluent that has to be purchased from Saudi Arabia.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as our government has stated repeatedly, we will ensure that Aboriginal consultations fully meet our duty to consult and are open and meaningful. We will continue meeting with First Nations groups to strengthen the ongoing dialogue between the federal government and First Nations. Resource projects give Aboriginal communities the potential to turn the high cost of isolation into a huge advantage of proximity. In fact, most mines and exploration properties in Canada are located within 200 kilometres of an Aboriginal community. There are 400,000 Aboriginal youth under the age of 15, representing a major wave of potential new entrants into the labour market. And over the next 10 years, it's expected that Canada's resource sectors will need to hire thousands of workers. The scale of economic activity is enormous, and it's estimated there is a potential of $650 billion worth of major resource projects in Canada in the next decade. Such development will create thousands of new jobs. Right now, the resource industries make up about 1/5% of our national economy, creating and supporting more than 1.8 million jobs across our great country. In addition to good jobs they provide resource industries, they generate over $30 billion in royalties and tax revenues, funds that support schools, hospitals, and other vital services for all Canadians, including Aboriginal communities. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.